Hey, welcome to Longform North. I'm Ian Van Harten. A little over 25 years ago, a book by the historian Jack Granatstein came out called Who Killed Canadian History? It sparked some controversy back then about how ignorant most Canadians are about Canadian history and how riddled it is with politics and bureaucracy. And, Granatstein said, if you don't have any memory of your history, then you don't really know who you are, other than maybe not being American. But that was 25 years ago. What about today? Joining me for a discussion about who killed Canadian history is J.D.M. Stewart. He was a high school history teacher for 30 years. Now he's a writer, historian, and author, most recently of a book called Being Prime Minister. And he has another one coming out later this year. Okay, let's get to it. All right, J.D.M. Stewart. It's good of you to be here.
Thanks for having me on, Ian.
So why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit and let people know a bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I have been a high school history teacher for 30 years. I actually recently retired from teaching history itself. But I guess, the career story is that I've always loved Canadian history, and I decided to get into teaching and felt that that was a great way to try to teach kids about the beauty of history, teach young people about the country and what it's all about. And along the same lines as while I was teaching, I've always been a writer since I was a kid. It's interesting when you talk to people and you see what are the things in your life that have actually carried a narrative arc since you were a young person. And those are generally pretty important things to a person. And for me, certainly Canada has been part of that. Canadian history has been a part of that, and so has writing. And so I've also done some writing, and my first book came out in 2018, and it was called Being Prime Minister. And I don't know, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that book later. But I've always done a lot of freelance writing in newspapers and other forums to write about Canadian history and political figures and sometimes sports history. So I'm a teacher and I'm a writer, and I live in Toronto, as I have for 25 plus years.
Great. So we're going to be talking about this book by Jack Granatstein, Who Killed Canadian History, which is about how little most Canadians know about Canadian history and some problems with the way it's being taught, and some other topics too that we'll be getting into. But I'm wondering, as a way of getting us started, if you can kind of pick up on what you were saying and talk a bit more about what got you interested in Canadian history in the first place, especially since so few people apparently do get interested in it.
Yeah. Well, let me pick up on a couple of threads here. First, your mention of Jack Granatstein's book, Who Killed Canadian History, which came out in 1998. And at that time in my life, I was actually teaching history in Panama. I did a couple of years overseas. And I wrote Jack Granatstein a letter when the book came out. And I said, what a great book this is. I really agree with you. And he wrote back to me, and I still have a copy of the letter, because he wrote back to me. He said, what the hell are you doing in Panama? We need you back here in Canada. And so I always kept that letter on the bulletin board of my desk at school. So I guess, part of my feeling about Canadian history and really even maybe we want to call it Canadian sovereignty, Canadian identity. When I was growing up as a teenager in the 1980s, I felt that, Canada's always suffered from this lack of identity and a great Americanization in the way we viewed the world, the way we viewed our own country. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to get into teaching Canadian history was to teach what our story was, so that people knew what our perspective was, as opposed to, everybody would know George Washington was the first American president, but no one would know who the first Prime Minister of Canada was when they were a kid growing up. And so I wanted to fight against that. And I just feel that if a country really wants to understand itself and to have an identity, you need to understand the history of the country. So I think that's part of why I went to be a history teacher. And I started my teaching career in 1994. Granatstein's book comes out 4 years later. And, it was right at the beginning of my teaching career, and it really animated it for my entire career. In fact, I would use quotations from his book. At the beginning of the school year, you would have a night where parents would come in and find out what are the courses that their children are taking, what are they all about. And so when I would present to them that, I'm going to be teaching your child Canadian history, and I'd have a little slideshow, and I would always have a quote from Granatstein's book, the one about, a nation that doesn't know its past is like somebody walking around like an amnesiac walking around the streets. They don't know who they are. So that's why I got into teaching, and that's sort of how Jack's book has always touched me.
Well, yeah, so let's get into some of the topics that he raises in this book. One of the big ones is just the massive amount of ignorance that exists amongst Canadians about Canadian history. And so he cited a bunch of surveys and data that came out to kind of verify this. But as you say, the book came out in 1998. That was a little over 25 years ago. I'm wondering if you can speak to what's the state of things now? Has anything changed? Has it gotten any better?
It's a good question, and it's hard to know the answer in a lot of detail. I guess I would say the short answer is that not a lot has changed. Not a lot has changed because we still are fighting the battles of trying to get Canadians to know more history. The same number of provinces that required a high school Canadian history course, there's been no improvement in that regard. I think in some way, the positive side of things, I think, is that I think we're a bit more aware of the importance of Canadian history now, but we just haven't done enough. We haven't sustained that effort over a long period of time. Let me give you a couple of examples. So Jack's book comes out in 1998, which, as you say, is more than 25 years ago. And I think the fact that we're talking about the book 27 years later speaks about the impact of that book. But in 2001 is when CBC's Canada, A People's History comes out. And this was a landmark television series that millions of Canadians watched, and it got used in a lot of high school history courses. Now, unfortunately, this is another interesting place for you to investigate, or some of your listeners to investigate. You can't watch that series anymore. CBC doesn't make it available. They don't show it on their network, and they don't post it on CBC Gem. So I'm sort of going off on a few tangents here, but this is the way I think your long-form podcast can go. But I think your original question was, how are things different from 1998 when the book came out? So in some ways they're the same. We're still having the battles. We still don't think Canadians know enough about their past. But there at least have been efforts. There have been efforts to improve historical knowledge. And then, every once in a while, something comes along, and in this case it's the threats from the United States, make Canada 51st state. All of a sudden Canadians have sort of done a reflective moment and turned inward and wondered, actually, we're not American, and we don't have to take all of their cultural offerings. And we have a history of our own that's worth celebrating. We have a culture of our own. And so, there is this moment right now where I think we're trying to grasp onto a little bit more about who we are. And if you think about the importance of history, which is Granatstein's main point, is history is important and it needs to be taught. And of course, I think anybody would agree with that. But you think about, don't you think you could understand today's moment quite a bit better if you had a decent understanding of Canada-U.S. relations? So history is a great tool for us to help understand the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's get into how it's being taught in schools. So Granatstein describes this shift where, I guess traditionally maybe, historical content was taught chronologically to give a sense of here's where we came from and here's how we got to where we are now. And so there's been a shift away from this because of what he calls modern educational theory.
Yeah.
To where instead they're pulling out themes almost in isolation to highlight certain topics or certain ideas or aspects about Canadian society. And so maybe you lose this sense of cohesiveness in terms of where we came from. So can you talk maybe a bit about why this change would be done? Like, is there something wrong with teaching history chronologically?
No, there's nothing wrong with it. But it is a debate in history classrooms, or at least among teachers. Are we going to teach it chronologically? Are we going to teach it thematically? And I think some of I don't know all the theory behind it, but I guess some people think that students can learn better if you have information packaged in a theme, and maybe it allows you to highlight different things more than other things. Because when you do unfold a curriculum chronologically, which is the way I would advocate, it should be done chronologically, and I always supported that. Although, to be honest, occasionally I would teach thematically, because it sometimes can be useful to get through a large amount of material if you chunk it out into themes. So sometimes using both methods can work. But there are some people who think chronology is just bad, and I don't know what the reasons are. Sometimes teachers are always experimenting with new ways of doing it. I think maybe the thought was maybe that chronology was kind of boring. And do you know what's really important, Ian? And you could probably speak to this because you were a high school student and took grade 10 Canadian history. Presumably, if you grew up in Ontario, you would have had to take it. It kind of, in a way, doesn't matter if it's going chronologically or thematically. What's really important is how good is your teacher. So a really gifted teacher is going to make history really exciting and interesting no matter how it's taught. So my first priority wouldn't be chronology versus theme. It'd be how good is the teacher. So we got to put that on one side here as well. But if you just make a straight choice, I'm going to say, the world unfolds in a chronological way. History unfolds in a chronological way. And that is the best way to try to understand the aspects of cause and effect, is by looking at things in chronology. So I think my vote would go for chronology for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, so can you speak more a bit about, so if it's really the teacher that matters more, and I think I agree with you on that, is there something that can be done to increase the amount of good teachers versus bad teachers that we have in schools?
Yeah. That's, there is a lot that can be done about that, by the way. There should be things done about it. But let's just pick up on the teaching thread for a minute, because it's so important, because the teacher will inspire the student to learn X, Y, or Z. And I think that does trump things a lot more than chronology versus theme. But here's the other thing that's kind of important here, is that I knew there was another point that I wanted to make, and it lost me, but now it's come back, is that the teaching of history has changed a lot since 1998. And I think that's really important for anyone who is engaging in the debate about Canadian history, if we're just talking about what's happening in schools, is that teaching has improved a lot in the last 25 years. I think in the pre-2000s, there was a lot of really bad history teaching happening. And I think that's where the bad rap for chronology came from, is just writing stuff on the board and going from year X to year Y. Now we're a lot more engaged. And what's really important in terms of history and in terms of teaching it is the tools that you use. Are you using primary sources? Are you making connections to current events? Are you trying to engage the interests of your students? So the whole pedagogical aspect of Canadian history is a very important and separate question from what's going on in the public sphere about how important we think it is. But we should never underestimate the importance of teaching in this question.
Because part of me wonders too sometimes, when you learn math, you do drills, and you just kind of repetition, and you drill it into your brain that 3 times 4 is 12 and 3 times 5 is 15, et cetera, et cetera. And because Granatstein writes about how there's cultural capital that we need in order to read a newspaper or understand current events, and a lot of that comes from learning history. And so part of me wonders, do we need to just drill into students, here's important dates, here's important things, so that it's part of it's in our minds, and it's in our memory, and so we kind of can call it up and know about it that way? But maybe that's too boring or too.
Yeah, I wouldn't advocate for drilling history into anyone. It makes sense for things that are meant to be rote, like the times tables. But for history, the way to do it is to capture interest and get people exploring. You know, no one's going to be, or people aren't going to remember everything they took in grade 10 Canadian history, and I don't think they really have to. But if they can develop a familiarity with the content, if they can recognize something about the First World War, if they're reading a newspaper article sometime later, that's going to be good enough for me. We want to develop. Remember, we're getting now into the whole skills versus content debate. History is a big part. A big part of it is teaching skills, very important ones: research, evaluation of events, considering bias, critical thinking, writing. There's some very important, constructing narratives. There's some very important skills there. There's also some very important content. And so another one of the debates in the history world is, do we emphasize skills or do we emphasize content? Where do we find that beautiful balance of the two? And later in my career, I became less beholden to the content. Not to say that I didn't think it was important, because I still would base my lessons on significant content. But what I became more interested to do was cultivate in my students an interest in the subject. Because if you cultivate an interest, they carry it with them. If you bury it or you make it terrible, that's the end. So I think I was pretty successful in cultivating the interest for my students, but that's what I became more interested in doing. So when you come to history class, you leave the class going, I had a good time, and I learned something as well. So we're sort of veering off into pedagogy and history classrooms a little bit more than maybe you were expecting. But on the other hand, most people's engagement with history is the one that they had in grade 10. And I can guarantee you, if they had a boring, crappy teacher, they probably don't like Canadian history. If they had a teacher who was pretty exciting and interesting and made it relevant for them, maybe they still like history, those people. Like, where did you fall on that spectrum?
Probably my grade 10 history wasn't great. And that's no beef against the teacher, but it didn't leave me inspired.
Right, right, right. And why? What do you think the reasons for that were? Was it because the teacher didn't seem to care, or was it that you just weren't ready for history? Like, what do you think it was?
Probably, I think I wasn't ready for history. But, even saying that, I think probably the right teacher could have met me where I was.
Right.
So, my experience, the teacher we had he was very concerned that history not be boring. And
Oh,
so he didn't want to just take notes on the board or just talk about something that happened. Everything was kind of, it had to be a presentation that we did, or it had to be something we're watching, and so it came away kind of, and maybe there would have been a good way to do that too, but it came away with, I didn't come away with learning like these are things that happened in Canadian history. It was just a bunch of random presentations I had to put together.
right, right. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it's every classroom's a little bit different. Every experience is a little bit different, and I think as long as the teacher was trying to do the best that he or she could, then I guess that's all we can ask. But for you, the experience wasn't as good as it needed to be.
I mean, I'm here now. I got interested eventually. So, but maybe we can pick up on that in terms of other people that helped inspire that. But there's another aspect that we can try pick up on here. So, you helped during when it was the 25th anniversary of the book. You helped commemorate that by organizing and helping put together a series of articles for the Hub.
Yes.
And one of the contributors there was a fellow historian of yours, Christopher Dummett. And he wrote an article there. And I'm wondering if I can just read a quote from one of the articles he wrote and get your response to it. So here's Christopher Dummett writing for the Hub. Anecdotes of oppression are the new national narrative. A conception of Canada as merely a settler colonial nation, steeped in a racist history, whose people have been oppressed, and whose even ostensibly positive policies like official multiculturalism hide exclusionary tendencies. This is the new Canadian story. What say you, James?
I think there's some truth to that for sure, and there's a lot to try to figure out about it. So some of this relates to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when that report came out in 2015, which forced a major reckoning for all of Canada to deal with the residential schools crisis and the treatment of our Indigenous peoples since Confederation and before. But I'm just going to speak since Confederation just to give us a starting point with the birth of Canada as a country in 1867. So that forced a lot of difficult reckonings that were long overdue and necessary. At the same time, in 2015, there's a new government that comes into town led by Justin Trudeau, and for whatever reason, he thinks that Canada needs to apologize a lot for its history. And so this caught kind of the zeitgeist. It created a zeitgeist of the time that, Canada was kind of down on itself and its leadership was leading the way. If you remember during the years of, let's take Jean Chrétien as an example, he was always talking about how great Canada was. Stephen Harper would celebrate Canada and its achievements. And I think every prime minister should celebrate Canada and its achievements. And at the same time, of course, we do have to recognize in the expanse of Canadian history that there have been difficult moments for the country as well. Unfortunately, that narrative just got a little too strong, and I think people were afraid to push back on it because there could be ramifications for, your position at the workplace, or you might get called out on social media. Bad things could happen if you were trying to stand up for a cause that wasn't seen as the right cause at the time. So now you can see that the narrative is starting to shift back a little bit on this. And, I think we misrepresented the story of Canada during that period. And I think that's what Christopher Dummett is getting at. Because, there's no one narrative of Canadian history. But the best one is the one that has a balance to it and that acknowledges the regrets and the failures of the country, but also acknowledges the achievements of Canada since its inception, because there are plenty of them. For some reason, when we've taken this view of Canadian history that Canada was mostly bad and mostly needs to apologize for things, people seem to have forgotten that actually Canada is one of the countries that everybody in the world wants to come to. And so if Canada is so really terrible, then why does everybody still want to come here? Canada is actually a remarkable achievement, and we're not all good. Maybe we did a little bit too much of that at some points, but we've achieved a lot as a country. We still have lots of things to continue to improve. Just like anybody, I always would sort of speak to my students and talk to them about, I always tried to make them think of Canada. I would use the metaphor that Canada is like a person, or Canadian history is like a person, or Canada is like a person in that no person is perfect. There's going to be mistakes made in the course of a person's life, and you atone for those things, but you're always trying to get better. And I think the history that was being told that Christopher Dummett is referring to, that I don't think that was really an accurate reflection. So it was a trend of the time, that period, 2015 to 2023, 2024. I'm not sure where we're going to put the end on it. That'll be an interesting one to reflect on as the years go on.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that period is over now?
I wouldn't say it's over, but I think that there's starting to be some pushback against it. There are people speaking out against things a little bit more. There's books coming out. There's a historian named Patrice Dutil who wrote a book about Sir John A. Macdonald that came out last year that kind of tries to set the record straight about some of the things that were happening during his period in office. I think we're trying to get a more balanced approach right now.
Well, it kind of leads me to another question, which is there a moral component when it comes to discussing or studying history? And that is it important to identify and condemn immoral things that happened, and conversely to point out positive moral actions that we want to praise? Or does that kind of moral lens only prevent us from really understanding and stepping into what it was like in the past?
No, I think the moral judgments are always happening, right? They happen in our life. It happens in history. So it is important to look for morals in history. You have to point out things that were wrong, and you have to have discussions about things that were wrong. When things go awry is when we say, oh, I can't believe that that's how they acted. And when you start to project your own values from 2025 or the whatever period, the period of now, if you try to project your values that we hold dear today and say that people in 1885 or 1910 or 1935 should have been acting as progressive as we are, then that's not appropriate. That's not really historical. But of course we make judgments. There's bad things that happened in history. There's people who made poor decisions. There's people who made racist decisions, like all the bad things, racism, sexism, classism. Lots of bad things have happened in history, and we need to try to understand why they happened and learn from them. And we have to piece it as part of the whole puzzle and see how it fits on a line of progression or regression, as the case may be. But I would just underline that we don't want to try to shake our fingers and say people of the 1930s bad people, or people of the 1870s bad people. They're doing what they are with the things that they understand at the time. But it is very hard in sort of a philosophical way, I think, for people to get themselves out of their present and try to imagine themselves in 100 years ago or 130 years ago, because you would not be the same person. We are products of our times. So it's not like you're going to go back and be running around in 1895 and being a progressive person. No, you'll be very much shaped by the times in which you live. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that people are shaped by the times in which they live. They acted differently from us, but that doesn't make them bad people. Some people were bad, but not just by living in those times does that make them bad, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. I wonder too if part of the difficulty is if it feels like making a moral compromise if you make the effort to try to understand something that is really immoral. Like, say, if you want to understand the idea behind residential schools and how people who were architecting them were thinking. And maybe that makes me feel like, yeah, I'm compromising my morals to try to even look at things from their point of view. I wonder if that makes it more complicated.
Well, history is complicated. That's number one. Number two, I always thought that it was kind of a virtue to try to understand somebody else. So to try to understand another period, to me, that seems like a virtuous thing to do as opposed to a immoral thing to do. I can see why people might say, well, if you understand why something bad was happened, then you must be bad yourself. Well, that doesn't make any sense if you ask me. But that's what some people probably think is true. So ultimately, our job, and it does take, understanding history takes quite a bit of understanding and patience and setting aside some of your own present day values. But that's one of the great challenges, is to try to figure it out. Like, how did that happen? Why did that happen? What were the other competing factors? And remember, most of history is just people doing things, and people are complex figures, and we want to try to figure them out. And that's probably, I think, why a lot of people are drawn to history, is because of that human element of thinking, well, would I have done the same thing if I was in that same position? I don't know. And so the goal is understanding. The goal should never be trying to take out some sort of punishment or make some morality point. I don't think, understanding history isn't about making a point or a moral lesson necessarily, but it is about trying to understand things and then explaining, not moralizing, explaining. There's a lot of moralizing in history right now. In some ways it can't be helped. And, I don't think that's a terrible thing, but you just have to be careful with it. And what happens in today's world, as you probably know, there's rushes to judgment. There's a wish for simplicity and simple answers, when in fact if you look at your own relationships, your most important relationships in your life, they are probably very complex. Relationships with your parents that have gone on for a long time. These are complex relationships. History is very complex too, and there's a lot of moving parts. So efforts to try to make it seem black and white are misguided, if you ask me.
Let's move out of the educational sector a little bit and start looking at history as it's presented in public. So one aspect of this is the role of popular historians. And so thinking back to when you were talking about teachers that help inspire you to be interested, for me, Pierre Burton was that teacher. So I think the popular historians play an important role. There's Pierre Burton, there's Peter Newman. There's a few comic books that have come out too, like Chester Brown wrote one on Louis Riel that was kind of cool. There's the People's History documentary series that you mentioned. These things are legitimately popular and help educate the public about Canadian history. So there's an important role, I think, here. But although Jack Granatstein kind of writes about some tension between popular historians and academic historians, and maybe one is kind of sneering at the other. I don't know if you can speak more to that, but can you just say more about the role of popular historians when it comes to teaching about Canadian history?
The popular historians are really important, and I think you mentioned a few of them. Pierre Burton. I read lots of Pierre Burton's books. I met him once, which was great. And actually, I should tell you a story. So he wrote a book called Vimy, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
Came out in 1986. And story of Vimy Ridge. Well, don't you know it? My first child was born on the anniversary of Vimy Ridge on April 9th. So I wrote a letter to Pierre Burton and said, Dear Mr. Burton, believe it or not, my son was born on April 9th. I'd love to have a signed copy of your book. So he wrote me back, and I got the letter framed. It says, Dear Mr. Stewart, congratulations on your Vimy baby. And then he says, go get a copy of the book. If you send it to my office, I'll sign it and send it back to you. So that's what I did. And so my son has a signed copy of Vimy by Pierre Burton, dated just a few months after he was born. So Pierre Burton was, so important to building up our identity and understanding of Canadian history. You mentioned Peter C. Newman. He's probably the greatest writer of them all. I'd give my left arm to be able to write sentences like he could. He's tremendous. And, Granatstein has written so much. Now, he's an academic historian, but we still have popular historians writing books. People like Charlotte Gray, Alan Levine. A lot of journalists are doing it. John Ibbotson wrote a book on Stephen Harper. He wrote a book on Diefenbaker and Pearson as a dual biography. So it's great to see that these kind of books are being written. The academics, I think, are focused on things that are a little bit less popular. Probably our best academic historian, I'm just going off the top of my head, but, Tim Cook is one of our best. Now, he doesn't work at a university. He works at the Canadian War Museum. But he writes lots of books about Canadian military history, and they're well read. They sell thousands of copies, and they're excellent pieces of scholarship and writing. So it's important to have these folks. I've always been inspired by all the people that we've mentioned, plus, a couple of American historians that I love, like Gilles Lepore, who wrote a great American history book a few years ago called These Truths. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote the famous book on Lincoln, Team of Rivals. She's a beautiful historical writer. So thankfully we have some of these writers. I don't know, not all of them are popular historians. A lot of them are just writers who write books, journalists who write books. But we certainly need them because they know how to tuck into a vein that, writing in a way that's accessible for people, which is really important. The academics, Granatstein criticizes them for being a little too esoteric 25 years ago. And I think to some degree that's still quite true.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned you've written a book, Being Prime Minister, and I believe you have a new one coming out in the next few months. Could you talk maybe a bit about what it's like writing in this space of popular history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I like it, I guess. I mean, as much as people can like writing, writing's pretty hard. I think it's important. So I think number one, I think it's important. We still need to have books about Canadian history that are being published that tell our stories and that people are interested to buy them and read them. So my book, for example, is the one that's coming out in September 2025. It's the first new history of Canadian prime ministers in 25 years. That's a whole generation. The last book that came out that was a history book on Canadian prime ministers was 1999, and it was written by Jack Granatstein and Norm Hilmer. The one before that was Michael Bliss's book, Right Honorable Men, came out in 1994. So it's been 25 years since we had one of these books. So I'm glad to be able to be the person that is writing it, but I wish we had more. Let's take a guy like Wilfrid Laurier. There hasn't been a biography of Wilfrid Laurier, a scholarly one, like an important one, for 60 years. 1965 was, there's been a few smaller books, 150 pages here, 200 pages there, but nothing magisterial for one of our greatest prime ministers. So to me, that's a problem. So in terms of writing in this space, it's important. But remember, you don't make any money. You can't just go, I'm going to write history books, and that's how I'm going to make my living. The only people that are doing that, well, Pierre Burton did it, Peter C. Newman did it. Tim Cook might be able to do it because he sells enough copies probably, but he's a historian, so his income is backstopped by being a historian at the Canadian War Museum. So the only reason I could do it was retired teacher. So this is a problem of publishing. It's not just history. That's just the problem of publishing in Canada, period. But I'm glad to be able to do it, to write this book, which I think is going to be an important one.
Let's try another topic here that I'm curious about, and that is history as a source of inspiration and national vision. So this is kind of connected with popular historians because a lot of books kind of feed into these bigger, grander narratives. And so we've seen some examples of history being invoked in this way recently. Like during the pandemic, I remember Justin Trudeau mentioning this was our World War II. And so we have to kind of respond similarly and to get through this. And even more recently with the conflict with the United States, you're hearing more invocations of the War of 1812. And didn't we burn down the White House that one time? So I'm kind of curious about this way of using history because it seems to me, that it can be used for propaganda and someone can just use this to feed their own agenda. But there's also an equal negative way of using it, which is sort of it leads to the creation of a romanticized ideal that's not rooted in reality. And so yeah, I'm kind of giving you a lot to respond to here, but I'm wondering if you can speak to this a little bit, in particular, the way that Canada uses history for inspiration and what that might say about how healthy our relationship is with our past.
Margaret Macmillan wrote a book called The Uses and Abuses of History. And so history can be used to propagandize and paper over things. It can be used to propagandize you can make history almost say anything you want. And so you have to be careful not to just let history become some cheerleading thing that papers over problems. The point is to tell the truth. And sometimes the truth is about reckoning with things that have gone wrong in your country. Other times it's about celebrating your achievements. There are things to celebrate in Canadian history, and I think that's okay to celebrate. So it just can't be all one and not the other. When you talked about 1812, that's reminding us of a period we had in our history where, Canada wasn't even a country then, but the country we call Canada today was fighting back against the Americans. So you don't want history to be a propaganda tool. That's not what history is. It is about explaining. It's about a search for truth. It's about trying to understand. So those are the goals. And as we reach back into history, it's to help us understand today better. It's not to try to kick somebody down. It's not to try to make us seem better than somebody else. That's not what it's about.
Did you have any response when you heard those recent invocations, like during the pandemic or with the War of 1812 stuff?
The War of 1812 stuff was probably it's almost like a little cliche thing, like a little prop you grab in a theater. The Harper government made a big deal of the War of 1812. They got criticized for it, but it was the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, and I didn't have a huge problem with it. It did remind the country that there actually was a history before 1867. There was, military operations happening here. It's probably not a terrible thing if it got people to go into their history books a little bit more. In terms of the pandemic, when people were saying, "Oh, this is our World War II," again, it's kind of like, people grab on to things in history to try to. It's like something that semi-stable that gives you a little bit of a support to try to understand. It's about trying to understand again, right? And so when people are making comparisons, usually they don't really make a lot of sense because they need to actually be really well thought out first. So when people are saying, this is our World War II, well, what they're really trying to say is this is a really big deal and it's affecting the whole world and our lives might change and the government's going to be getting involved and people are dying. They're not dying on the battlefield, but they're just reaching for ways to try to cope and understand. They're not always accurate, but it's okay if people try. But that's another reason why you have to be always very aware and arm yourself with facts and understanding. Because what happens, and this is what happened in, I think, the case with Sir John A. Macdonald and Ryerson and the taking down of the statues and everything, is people were saying a bunch of things and it was like maybe half true at best. But if you don't know any better, you can just listen to the loudest voices and you just think that they're probably telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's kind of we'll wrap things up here with one last question. I'm just wondering. So, what do we do? We have this problem with Canadians. A lot of Canadians are ignorant about our history. It's not always taught very well, and it's politicized, and so there's many problems that Granatstein laid out way back in 1998 that are still around. So I'm wondering if you can offer some guiding principles or some ideas that could maybe help bring us towards a more healthy relationship with our history and help promote the education of history.
Well, it's true to form for you, Ian, to ask like a really big question that would require a really long answer, but we'll see what we can do to unpack it. I think there's a number of things that have to be done. And we didn't even talk about the Library and Archives Canada, which is the storehouse for Canadian history. It's not well funded. I don't think it's well run. I don't get the sense that the people there are trying to make history as interesting and accessible as possible. So I'd love to see a revitalization of Library and Archives Canada. In terms of teaching, the debate for a long time has been about how can we get more Canadian history in the schools? And this is a legitimate and important question. There are only 5 provinces that require a high school course in Canadian history. It's Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and British Columbia. All the other ones just have a mishmash of social studies, geography, economics, civics. I mean, don't get me started on civics. People don't understand how the government works either. That's another story. But I think we need to say, okay, why are we not having at least one high school Canadian history course in every province in the country? That battle's been talked about for decades. I don't know how you solve that problem. Nobody seems to want to. I don't know. There's a lot of inertia in education. So that would be one place to start. It's also hard because, education is a provincial jurisdiction under the Constitution, so you can't say we're going to have a national program. I'd like to see some money spent on making Canadian documentaries again, because let's face it, I'd love to see more books being published on Canadian history, and there are some publishers like Sutherland House works really hard to try to publish Canadian history, but visuals are where you're going to find a lot of eyeballs. So how about some sort of program? Like, I'd like to be the Minister of Canadian Heritage, which I think is now called the Minister of Canadian Identity or something, but I'd like to see some serious money spent on trying to make documentaries about Canada's past, because we did a decent job of it for a number of decades, but I think we're in like a history time warp. What's the word? Black memory hole. We're in it, to use Orwell's term. We're in a history memory hole since basically, I don't know, 1985. You don't see a lot of new things coming out about Canadian history. Let me give you an example, and this is sort of history related, but also entertainment. There was a several part sort of docudrama made about Mackenzie King in the 80s. There's also one on Wilfrid Laurier. When Pierre Trudeau died in 2000, by 2002 there was a 2-part 4-hour miniseries on the Trudeau years with Colm Feore playing Pierre Trudeau. Within 2 years they had this CBC thing. Well, Brian Mulroney's been dead for a year, just over, and I haven't heard anything about the 2-part Brian Mulroney series, because there's a lot of drama in history to be told by telling a good story about Brian Mulroney and his history. There's so many different things we could be making documentaries about, and I'd like to see that happen. And I would say the sort of the demarcation point is that 2001 series, Canada, A People's History, which came out in '01, and then we've hardly done anything since then. So teaching, at the provincial level, publishing, making films, Library and Archives Canada, just as another example. You used to be able to search the Mackenzie King diary online. It had its own dedicated website, and you would just put in the date and it would spit out the diary for that day. Now they moved it into some omnibus research place on the website, and it's very unuser friendly, and it doesn't spit out the pages in the same easily accessed way. And that's just another example of not making history easy and accessible. The Library and Archives Canada they also took down their website dedicated to Canadian prime ministers. I don't think that was very smart either. So we've got lots of problems, and it's kind of discouraging that 25, 27 years later, we're talking about Jack Granatstein's book, and I'm here saying to you, well, we still have a lot of problems, and we're still fighting these battles. But thankfully, there are people willing to fight them, because if we didn't, then we'd be really snookered. And so we're lucky that we still have people who care about the country and who want to teach the history. There's a lot of dedicated teachers out there who are trying to teach Canadian history. But everything, it's a battle, which is one that I fought for 30 years and still fighting in other ways now. So I'm going to keep fighting.
Right on. Well, James, you've given us a lot to think about, and it's been great talking to you. And I appreciate the work you're doing, and thank you for doing this.
It's my pleasure, but let me ask you a question, though, Ian. I know you're the questioner, but I can't help it. As a former teacher, I like to ask questions too. But
Okay.
What's your view of the issue? Like, where do you see the debate going, or what bothers you about Canadian history right now, or the state of?
What bothers me, so I kind of sense that very few people care. And, just as an example, as kind of a barometer for testing this, I always feel like I'm a bit naive in my expectations. But when the recent election was starting,
Yeah.
I kind of thought this is a big election, and this is a big deal, and this is a big moment for Canada, an election that will kind of be remembered. And I was sort of let down in terms of the opportunity there was there for some debate and some discussion and some engagement, and I found that it was lacking. So yeah, that's kind of one example of where I'm coming from, or how I see it, maybe.
Yeah, apathy can be really dangerous, and that's why when I sort of ended my remarks by saying I'll keep fighting, which I will. And I think it's important that people who have passions and causes that relate to the country, they have to keep fighting for them, because I don't know who said it, but countries like Canada, they don't just exist once you create them. You actually have to keep fighting for a country like Canada because it's an improbable nation given its geography, ethnicity, and so you have to keep nurturing Canada and telling the stories and building an identity. Like it's hard, but you have to keep doing it. Well, I appreciate you giving me the chance to talk about Canadian history for an hour. That's pretty good.
Yeah, no, this was awesome. So hope we can do it again.
Sure, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode. Check out longformnorth.com, where you can subscribe to the Longform North newsletter and follow this show. And if you like this episode, think about sharing it with a friend. Music is by Aaron Barth, and I'm Ian Van Harten. Thanks for listening.